This is Insight with Haslinda Amin, and we're live at the annual Shangri-La Dialogue here in Singapore. Historically, the setting for top-level encounters between the U.S. and China. Competition between the two powers on the economic, technological, and military fronts has become the biggest issue for global security. President Trump's tariffs, imposed even on the closest U.S. allies, are now forcing many to rethink their reliance on Washington. And China has been looking to capitalize on this, so it is surprising many observers that Beijing has not sent its defense minister to this summit. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is set to speak on Saturday. And ahead on the show, we'll hear from John Moolenaar, who chairs the U.S. House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the U.S. and China. Plus, my conversation with New Zealand's defense chief. Welcome to Insight. Markets on a weaker footing today after a federal appeals court temporarily blocked the ruling that threatened to throw out the bulk of President Trump's tariff agenda. But despite the temporary stay, the possibility that the appeals court could ultimately back the original ruling hangs heavy over the White House, and the administration is looking at how to keep the tariff agenda alive.
Any trade lawyer knows there's just a number of different options we can take. If you look at the kind of things we've already done, it kind of gives you a roadmap on that. There's all sorts of numbers out there. There's 122, there's 301, there's 232, there's 338. There's all sorts of things we can do well within the law.
Meanwhile, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says trade talks with China have hit speed bumps and may need a call between Presidents Trump and Xi to kickstart.
I would say that they are a bit stalled. I believe that we will be having more talks with them in the next few weeks, and I believe we may at some point have a call between the president and party chair Xi.
Meanwhile, tensions are rising again between the world's biggest economies. The Trump administration has announced it would start revoking Chinese student visas while also introducing new restrictions on the sales of chip design software and reportedly some jet engine parts to China. John Moolenaar chairs the U.S. House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the U.S. and China. He told us Washington is seeking to reset its ties with Beijing.
China will try and leverage any business, any person that it can. So if there's a business doing, selling something into China and they can figure out a way to leverage that, they will. In the same way, countries that become dependent on China, whether it's for critical minerals or supply chain, they run the risk that if they violate what China considers to be in their interest, they can get cut off from those materials. The United States has been cut off from certain critical minerals. Others countries have as well, and they will use that leverage. Right now we're seeing them use the debt leverage in developing nations through the Belt and Road Initiative, where countries become indebted to China and China leverages that against them. So I don't know about Elon Musk. I think he's made a contribution to our reducing spending and waste and fraud and abuse. Whether his business interests, I can't speak to that other than it's important that we recognize the threat from the Chinese Communist Party.
What's the view of the U.S. and your view on AI? Because right now we have a ban on AI chips to China. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang has come out to say that it weakens the U.S. position, should that continue, that it empowers Chinese AI players. How do you respond to that?
I don't agree with that. And I think, his goal is to sell chips wherever he can. The technology, he deserves to be commended. What NVIDIA has done is amazing, and But we also have to realize that those technologies can be used for purposes that would be directly counter to the national interests of the United States as well as the free world, because China has a dual use process where, it can be military, it can be civil use, but ultimately the military dominates. So all those technologies that are being developed can be used for military applications against people who love freedom. And so that's where governments have a role to step in, and it's different than just, contributing to the bottom line of an individual or a company.
Chairman Moolenaar, what is the end goal? Is it about not having, U.S. chips in China? Is it not having Chinese students in the U.S.? What's the vision? What's the picture? What's the end goal?
I think the end goal is to have a relationship with China that acknowledges the reality that their government is moving in a very different direction than they promised. And we have to reset that relationship. If China were to change course and promote actual peace and be responsible in the world stage, then I think, that would be healthy for the whole world. But if they continue down this path, it's going to be a threat to the world. When you look at their close allies of Russia, North Korea, Iran, and the partnerships that they're forming, that is a threat to the entire free world.
Are we looking at a decoupling between the U.S. and China? We know Treasury Secretary Besson says he's not after generalized decoupling, just in areas of critical interest to the U.S.
I think it's an area where we have to be strategic with sectors and make sure that we aren't enriching the Chinese military-industrial complex that can have weapons that would be used against us. And so, regular goods that are sold between the two countries, I don't think that's a problem. But when it comes to these critical technologies, AI, advanced batteries, uses for military equipment, I think we need to be strategic and recognize we don't want to see the further buildup of a very aggressive nation.
And that was my interview earlier with U.S. Congressman John Moolenaar. And of course, the reheating of U.S.-China tensions are a key focus here at the Shangri-La Dialogue, with the Chinese defense minister skipping the forum for the first time since 2019. Let's bring in our Asia security reporter, Alistair Gale, for more. We heard from Moolenaar saying that, he's looking for a reset in relations within the U.S. and China. Well, this is a missed opportunity without the defense minister of China.
It is. As you say, the Chinese usually send their defense minister to this event. It's an opportunity, for the Chinese to make the case about why they're not the problem in this region, why it's the U.S. They have a speech that the defense minister usually makes on Sunday. So a lower level official is going to make that speech. But also, the defense minister is obviously not going to be meeting with the U.S. defense minister, Pete Hegseth. So the question is, why would the Chinese do this right now? Obviously, there's a lot going on between the U.S. and China. Maybe they feel that this is not the right event for them to engage with the U.S. But as you say, there's an audience here for them to talk to of other defense ministers, countries in Asia that do have more friendly ties with China. So it does feel like a missed opportunity for them.
There are expectations that perhaps, strategic concerns as well as trade concerns are now, mashed into one, and that perhaps the visa issue, revoking aggressively visas from China as well as Hong Kong, may have played a part.
It may have done. We don't really know. The Chinese haven't explained why they're not sending their defense minister. Obviously, the Chinese military has got all kinds of issues right now. There's corruption investigations. There's questions about readiness. There's all kinds of, speculation about what's going on in the Chinese military. So those might be part of the factor here of why they're not sending the defense minister. But as you say, relations are really in turmoil now with the U.S., and they may have decided that, coming here to Shangri-La is not something they want to do this time around because they want to send a message to the U.S. perhaps.
There's a lot of questions about the reliability of the U.S. as a strategic partner. This is a U.S. that's pushing back on defending democracies around the world. And there is expectation that countries, especially in the Indo-Pacific, are looking for alternatives. Is there really an alternative to the U.S.?
Well, we're expecting Pete Hegseth to make a speech tomorrow morning where hopefully he will provide more detail on what the US sees its role in this region being. He has talked about rebuilding deterrence against China, working with allies such as Japan and Australia. So what we're looking for is a little bit more detail about what the US is going to bring to this relationship with other countries. As you say, there are question marks about the US commitment. President Trump has criticized allies like Japan and South Korea for not paying enough for the US military. The president also wants to make deals, with other countries. So there's question marks about whether they can, countries like Japan and Australia can rely on the US. I think we're looking for some reassurance tomorrow when the Defense Secretary speaks, that the US is here to stay. So this is a big opportunity for him to make that case.
More than reassurance, it's also about showing me the money. What are you bringing to the table?
Right.
What assets are you willing to deploy, right, when it comes to the US playing that deterrent role?
That's right. I mean, Hegseth was here in the region in March. He came to Japan. He was in the Philippines, and he talked about the commitment. But as you say, those countries are looking for more detail. They want to know what is the US going to do in terms of asset deployments. It's talked about refocusing on the Indo-Pacific and moving away from, obviously, the European theater and Ukraine. Is the US going to bring, more ships, more missile launchers? What is the US planning to do? Obviously, a lot of this is very sensitive, and we're not expecting the Defense Secretary to give us, detailed plans. But countries like Japan, countries like the Philippines, want to know a little bit more about what the US intends to do. What is the substance of its commitment to this region?
As people question the relevance and reliability of the US, we know that Europe is repositioning itself in this part of the world. Macron, poised to make that keynote address later today. And of course, he is positioning France as well as Europe as a more reliable partner. But, when it comes to Indo-Pacific and Europe, there's no history and, of course, a lack of trust.
Right. Well, there is a shared concern now, obviously, about China. So the European countries do feel that, they have to respond to this China threat as well. But as you say, we're a long way from Europe. And we do occasionally see, European warships coming through the region. This year, the UK Carrier Strike Group is going to be in Asia. So they do like to show that they have a presence here and contribute to the deterrence of China, saying, look, we're going to complicate your calculus. If you're thinking about doing something aggressive in this region, you have to consider the fact that we might be here as well. But I think the reality is that there's only so much they can do. They can't stretch themselves into the Asia-Pacific theater on any kind of a regular basis in the way that they have to deal with things in Europe, have to deal with the Russian threat. So, there's a limit to what can be done by Europe. It'd be very interesting to hear what President Macron says about, what France's intentions are, how it sees the Indo-Pacific. So it will be an interesting speech.
Not to mention that until now, its spending on defense has been pretty meager. Alistair, thank you so much for that. Asia security reporter Alistair Gale there. Now, as we mentioned earlier, a federal appeals court offered President Trump a temporary reprieve from a ruling threatening to throw out the bulk of his sweeping tariffs. Let's get more analysis with Bloomberg's Derek Wallbank. How is this being read, Derek?
Well, thank you, Haslinda. Look, I think that this is a whiplash that we're seeing from the U.S. legal process, and it's not unexpected that you do get swings and roundabouts in these processes, but it can be exceptionally confusing, especially when you consider this is this signature global economic policy from this president, right? Earlier this week, all of Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, as well as a couple of others, were effectively tossed by a court. Then that was appealed, and the appellate court has not yet rendered a judgment, but has stayed that earlier ruling, so sort of put it on pause. So the tariffs are back. This is eventually something that may be destined for the U.S. Supreme Court, on which Republicans hold a 6-3 majority in terms of who nominated the justices involved. So it is a somewhat friendly venue to some things that Trump has tried to do in the past. But at the same point, this was always a place where there was some vulnerability. Now, I should stress here, Haslinda, there are Plan B options available. The White House has signaled very hard that if they are to be blocked on this, and they have said that they're going to appeal and go through that, But if they are blocked here, they do see that they have other options by which to pursue the tariff case. In most of those cases, though, those are a little bit narrower or could be a little bit delayed in terms of the options.
Is there a sense of how this development might impact trade negotiations?
Well, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has said earlier today he hasn't noticed a change in posture from negotiating partners from other countries that are looking to get deals done. Certainly there are talks scheduled with the Japanese delegation upcoming. But look, I think that all of this stuff is going to be very, very closely watched in other world capitals. Now, the caution that I would point on this is that I would say very few people really deeply understand this sort of thing. And this is a combination of trade law plus appellate law and all of that stuff. It's very murky. I think people in Washington were taken by surprise by this week's events. I can't imagine the sort of surprise that would be there in foreign capitals. But there is a lot of uncertainty. And Haslinda, you and I have talked about that word uncertainty a lot before. Trump is more comfortable with uncertainty than a lot of other folks. But the other folks will have to be figuring out how much uncertainty they are comfortable with, how you hedge those bets. Because, yes, on paper, this reduces Trump's negotiating position. But at the same point, how much do you want to read into that when he said he's going to do this anyway? It's a very difficult waiting game. It's a very difficult handicapping kind of thing for all of these capitals to do as they consider how do you approach Donald Trump and his negotiating team on the issues that underline trade with a global superpower.
Derek, might we see a shift in strategy?
Well, certainly the Trump administration, if they lose this, are preparing for a strategic shift. They say that they're ready for that. You also could see other countries come up with a bit of a strategic shift in terms of how they're approaching this. We haven't necessarily seen that yet, but it's very, very early days, so I wouldn't necessarily rule that out per se. What I would say is that, I said a little bit earlier, but it bears emphasis. If the sweeping tariff authority that the White House is claiming is ruled out, ultimately, the ways that they could go at this, again, would be narrower, might be time-capped, or possibly they might be forced at some stage to go to Congress to get approval of that, which would be very difficult and would suck up time from other legislative priorities, not least of which Trump's one big beautiful bill on tax cuts.
Derek, thank you so much for that. Bloomberg senior editor Derek Wallbank there. Now, still ahead on the show and in this hour, we'll hear exclusively from Taiwan's Deputy Foreign Minister, who says trade talks with the U.S. will continue despite Trump's tariff challenges. That conversation coming right up. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Taiwan's Deputy Foreign Minister says he is optimistic of a progress in trade talks with the U.S., but technical details still need to be ironed out. We spoke exclusively with Chen Mingqi in Taipei on the status of negotiations and Taiwan's priorities.
The trade talk went smoothly. We are continue to have a conversation, and there are many technical details to settle. Like any trade negotiation, never been the easiest thing to do. So we are now in the process. 90 days, a little bit short, but we want to come up with some good, big and beautiful package to offer, and they will serve the dual purpose of meeting the U.S. need.
You mentioned that there are some technical issues to still be ironed out between the U.S. and Taiwan right now. Can you tell us what they are? I mean, what are sort of some of the priorities?
I think the first thing is to adjust the mutual expectation at the same level.
Yeah.
U.S. complaining about the non-trade barrier. We are working on that. We are in the negotiation to identify those areas they have a complaint, and we are thinking about, how to, one, protect our own people who are engaging in those industries. Second is to meet the needs. Third is in the context of our larger economic transformation.
Does Taiwan have any red lines in these negotiations or things?
I think there are some very important constituents. We want to protect our farmers, certainly, but we know that we have to be very vigilant about that. We also care very much about food safety. I think that is also another area to focus it on. But otherwise, we have the will to open our market to the U.S. product, especially.
Okay. Can you give us some details of
agriculture?
Agriculture?
Yeah.
Okay. Are any procurement plans in place right now?
Procurement plan, as announced, such as the LNG from Alaska. There's a big project. We are not only procure the LNG from Alaska, we are willing to, we have signed a letter of intent with the Alaska state government, not only the state government, but the firm they support to invest in the whole project, not only the buying the LNG, but also investing in the pipeline as a processing factory.
We heard from Taiwan, we heard from TSMC saying that if the U.S. were to put tariffs on chips, for example, that might derail Taiwanese companies' investment into the U.S. Can you explain the logic?
I mean, the thing is that you have a high tariff, then they probably either have a lower sale volume or they raise their costs. They reduce their cash flow. That to be invested in the United States. So we would like very much the U.S. to see this as an interconnected issue, the tariff and the investment. So the lower the tariff, the more cash flow they have to invest in the United States. We understand fully. And we also, I think TSMC is willing to tap into the talent of the United States as well as some leading technologies such as quantum. I think those things that need a big capital investment in the U.S. So we are going to do that, but don't let tariff get in the way.
Are you confident that you can get a deal with the U.S. in 90 days?
We are very optimistic. I think we can put it that way. From many reactions, I'm not in the whole face-to-face negotiation, but the knowledge that I have, the information that I have is that the whole thing has gone smoothly, and the both sides continue the conversation.
Taiwan's Deputy Foreign Minister speaking exclusively with Bloomberg's Yvonne Mann. Now, some of the top corporate stories we are following. Bloomberg's been told Hyundai is getting ready to raise prices across the board for its U.S. vehicles to cushion the blow from President Trump's tariffs. Sources say the Korean car maker is weighing a 1% price hike for every model in its lineup as soon as next week. The move would apply to newly built vehicles, not those already sitting on dealership lots. And Toyota will start producing 2 American-made all-electric models next year, adding to the company's existing EV lineup. It wants to have a total of 7 EVs on display and its U.S. dealership by mid-2027. The newly battery-powered cars will help fulfill Toyota's pledge to offer an electrified option for every model it makes globally by this year. Plenty more to come. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. We're keeping an eye on U.S. Treasuries as Trump pressed Powell to cut rates in a White House meeting. This is the first in-person meeting since his inauguration. And Trump told Powell that he was making a mistake not cutting rates. Remember that we've seen yields trending higher for U.S. Treasuries, and there's been a lot of uncertainties over the strength of its economy. The likes of Kashkari, though, say that the economy is on solid footing. Again, Powell under pressure from the Trump administration to cut rates. We're also keeping an eye on Japanese assets as they return from that lunch break. We're taking a look at the stocks and bonds resuming trade from lunch. Japanese stocks set to snap a 5-day rally. There are concerns about the tariff, of course, and the yen weighing on the Japanese markets. The strengthening currency, of course, puts a lot of pressure on its exporters. We're also watching the 2-year Japan bond auction that is coming up. So front and center, those JGBs on the back of those 40-year auction recently. Now, the annual SOHN Investment Leaders Conference is underway in Hong Kong. Hedge fund managers will present their ideas as financial markets face volatility, with global growth and supply chains under threat and geopolitical tensions also escalating. Let's cross over to Hong Kong, where Bloomberg's Annabelle Drewlers is standing by with more. Belle.
Thanks, Hans. Yeah, well, we might actually pick up on those points you were making around Japan there and bring in our next guest. This is James Smith from Palliser Capital, the founder and CIO. So thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us on Bloomberg Television. I want to kick off in Japan because this market for activist investing seems to be getting maybe even hotter and hotter. I mean, I think there was 30 different campaigns that were launched in May alone. But what are you seeing there and what are you most interested in right now?
Yeah, look, thanks, Annabelle, for having me on the show. Japan is, we would describe it as a cornucopia of opportunity right now. It's been a dynamic that's been developing over time. Lots of companies where there's a good product, there's an undervaluation, there's maybe a bloated balance sheet, the opportunity for capital return. So we consider to see a strong flow of opportunities for us to invest in Japan.
And how many companies roughly you engage with right now in Japan?
So I would say at any one time, anywhere between 5 and 10 companies would be in the midst of some kind of dialogue. Some more engaged than others, but that's the usual sort of clip that we experience at Palliser.
What's the one that's taking up most of your time at the moment?
So at the moment, we're highly engaged with a company called Keisei Railway, which has been a position of ours for some time. We put resolutions into the AGM last year, and we've been making suggestions around governance again this year. And then there are other situations, like one I'm going to discuss today at the conference, and which I can't go into too much detail on just now.
The support for those resolutions, where is it coming from? Where are you finding, in terms of the other investors, who's most supportive?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Annabelle. And I think it's a contrast with what we've seen over the past years in Japan and has changed more recently. What we've found is a great deal of the support and some of the most involved and most helpful dialogues that we've had with shareholders have been with the domestic asset management firms as opposed to necessarily the foreigners. Oftentimes the foreign shareholders are supportive, but what's different this time for us, in addition to Tokyo Stock Exchange and their positive initiatives for change, is that level of dialogue and engagement with local shareholders.
And what sparked that exactly, or what prompted the shift? We know the Value Up program has been underway for several years now, but is that it, or is there something else that gets you that support locally?
I think, that to us it feels like there's just a feeling within the business and investment community that it's time for change, that Japan can do better. And we've also felt this dynamic, for example, when we're looking for director candidates for boards. Lots of senior business executives in Japan, now they're available to take on non-executive director roles. You really hear from them this desire for change and improvement, and that feels to us as if it's across the board with the asset management firms, as I mentioned, but also among a number of individuals and business executives in Japan.
Tokyo Tadamono is another holding. What's your plan for that business?
So we made our views pretty clear on this company. Going back to last October, we presented on them in a conference similar to the SOHN Hong Kong conference, that time in New York. And we put forward a number of suggestions and ideas surrounding governance, surrounding capital return. and a fantastic portfolio of assets, and we're very pleased to see the company in the midterm plan they announced some months afterwards taking on board a lot of those changes, which really help create this positive momentum in the sector and in the market for that kind of change.
Can you draw the distinctions that you see or the similarities or differences that you see between the activist investing market in Japan versus Korea that has its own value-up program, even though it's a bit newer, of course, or much newer, really?
Yeah. A lot of history and experience on the side of Palliser in Korea. Many of the team were at Elliott before we got the business started at Palliser and had a lot of experiences there. I would describe it this way, that Korea, it has the potential to create the same kind of change and development we've seen in Japan, but it's a little bit behind. By consequence of it being a little bit behind, a lot of valuations are even cheaper. Clearly, there's been a little bit of political change there recently, as there often is in Korea. We're going to get some resolution on that through the election next week. And we're confident, as we have a number of positions there as well, that similar improvements and change are going to come through over time.
Yeah, the presidential election is taking place early next week. Regardless of the outcome, do you see greater support for activism in Korea moving forward?
I think so, and I think it's noteworthy that both major candidates have made comments, whether it's value up or boost up, as I believe one of the candidates is describing his ideas on corporate governance change and improvement. There does seem to be that dynamic for change across the board, so we're hopeful that that will play through to better performance, better governance, and critically better returns at some of these companies that are listed on the stock market there.
It's interesting you talk about the local asset managers in Japan being supportive of the changes you're trying to enact at businesses. What's something that's also quite particular about the Korean market is the really heavy role or big role that also retail investors can play in activism. So do you work alongside retail investors at all, or do you see a role for them to play in what you're also trying to execute?
I think there's definitely a role for retail shareholders to play in a market like Korea. In a historic engagement project with Samsung C&T, we saw strong retail interest in improvement. On our side, we've taken part in webinars and blogs that are directed at retail investors to try and help disseminate the kind of views that we have. And we've been pleased with the level of support and resonance that that's gained in many of those situations.
Last year at the SOHN conference in Hong Kong, you took the stage and you were outlining the case for Rio Tinto.
Yeah.
You've had a lot of engagement with that business over the past 12 months, but where exactly does it stand today?
Yeah, so it's certainly, Annabelle, been quite an involved project, that one, and we've seen resolutions lodged by us in both the PLC and limited AGMs. Not too much detail I can go into at this point. But we were pleased our proposal for a review of simplifying the organizational structure got the support of ISS and Glass Lewis and some key commentators, including some of your colleagues, actually, at Bloomberg on the news desk side. And look, I think, companies going through some changes. I read about some C-suite change last week, and we'll have to see how things play out in that particular situation. But a great company with great prospects, and we're pleased to be a long-term shareholder of that business.
Your proposal, or primary proposal, is to shift the primary listing back to Australia.
Yeah, look, I mean, in effect, what we proposed was a review surrounding a unification exercise very similar to the one that occurred at BHP some years ago. I think relevantly in that case, we saw some initial reluctance on the company side, but ultimately, several years down the track, that was an initiative that the company adopted and moved forward with. So it's similar to that, and we look forward to continuing our constructive engagement with that group over time.
Last question on Rio then. Do you see them following that path of BHP then? Do you see ultimately that the listing will change or the primary listing will change?
I mean, look, obviously it's something that we think would make sense because we put it forward so vocally to the AGM for a review. But look, as to whether they go down that path or not, we'll have to wait and see, Annabelle. So I can't offer you more than that.
No, I think I've pushed that one far enough.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But bigger picture, I mean, you're also active in the UK market. Are there any other regions or countries that are standing out to you, opportunities that you're seeing right now?
Yeah, we see a similar flow of opportunities in the UK, largely on valuation grounds, as we have in other markets, similar to Japan. Germany's a market where we really see some value and we see some opportunities. And look, we look opportunistically across Europe and Asia, and on occasion at the US as well. So there's plenty to keep us busy across these different markets at the moment.
And you mentioned the US, and of course it's a very difficult environment right now with just the constantly shifting headlines and the shifting rules around trade and tariffs. Is that making your life easier or more challenging?
Look, I think it's an extra thing to think about from an investment selection perspective, Annabelle. One has to. We're now in a process where there's some legal review of President Trump's intended tariffs, and we'll have to see how that develops over time. But we're careful to look at companies. In fact, the one we're going to talk about today at the SOHN conference is a good example where, however that develops, there's a good match between sales and production within the US, and so limited risk from a tariff perspective. And that's an important thing to keep in mind at the current time.
So then just digging then into the sectors that you look at in particular, which ones stand out to you?
So, across the board, really, we have no particular focus on any particular sector, and I'm able to say the flow is broadly similar in a lot of different areas. So nothing specific that we're on the lookout for from a sector perspective, Annabelle.
All right, James, thank you very much for your time this morning. That was James Smith there. He is the founder and CIO of Palliser Capital. I'll hand it back to you.
Belle, great conversation there. Thank you so much for that. Now, turning back to regional security concerns here in Asia. I spoke earlier with the New Zealand Defence Minister, Judith Collins, here at the Shangri-La Dialogue. I asked about her country's relations with the US and their role in the so-called Five Eyes intelligence sharing network.
I have no doubt at all that the relationship, the Five Eyes relationship, is very trustworthy, and that we can absolutely work with the US and trust their information and what we provide them, just as they do with us. It's a very long-standing relationship from just after World War II. But also, for a small nation like New Zealand to not be part of that would be, I think, a real tragedy for us. And it's one of the ways that we deal with the cyber attacks that we're constantly receiving, but it's also about understanding and trying to know where New Zealanders are in the world, how safe we can keep them, but also the Pacific region itself. Very important relationship, and I haven't seen any issues with that at all.
We talk about how the new world order or the global order has been upended by the US. The US is pushing back in defending democracies around the world, and some say that paves the way for China to play a bigger role in this part of the world. That has been China's narrative anyway. Are you seeing any evidence of that?
Well, we're seeing a certainly more robust position from China in the Indo-Pacific region. We've seen it around the Cook Islands. We're seeing it around the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, all of that. And what I would say is that the role in the Pacific for larger nations should be one where we work with Pacific nations. We're a Pacific nation ourselves. We say, well, we work with each other, we help each other, but what we never do is dictate, and that is very important. So I think, China's been increasing its work in the Pacific, and we're also seeing that the US is still working out quite where they're going to be. But I think I'm hoping the message from Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth is going to be very strongly that the United States understands it's a Pacific nation. It's a Pacific nation with a lot to lose if it's not involved. And I think that the US will stump up in the Pacific.
As you said, Pete Hegseth will be here representing the US, but we're not seeing the presence of the Chinese defense minister. How are you reading that?
Well, that's a very unusual situation. So the Chinese defense minister, Admiral Dong, has been absolutely at almost everything that we could possibly be at together. So I'm surprised by that. I'm not sure what to read in it, but I do think that there is a Chinese presence. He does have a deputy here, but it's unusual. And I think it's something many nations will be slightly surprised about.
Would you say it is a missed opportunity to have high-level discussions with the defense minister of China at a time of great uncertainty in the world?
Well, I think it's up to China. I mean, they'll decide who they send, so I don't want to read too much in it. But it is surprising. And but look, people sometimes can't attend for various reasons, and no doubt they've made a strategic decision.
And that was my conversation with New Zealand's Defence Minister Judith Collins. And stay with Bloomberg for more coverage from the Shangri-La Dialogue here in Singapore. We'll speak to a stellar list of guests, including the Australian Deputy Prime Minister, German Chief of Defence, as well as the Philippines Secretary of National Defence. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Insight, and here are some of the top global stories we're following. Harvard University has won a longer-term reprieve from a Trump administration ban on enrolling international students. Harvard sued the administration last week, claiming the ban was illegal. Washington maintains the Ivy League school failed to comply with the terms of its certification for enrolling foreign students. On Thursday, the U.S. moved to start revoking visas for Chinese students with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields. The U.S. Justice Department has asked a federal judge to dismiss its criminal case against Boeing over 2 fatal crashes of its 737 MAX jets. The reversal in the long-running case over the disasters in 2018 and 2019 comes despite objections from some family members of the 346 people killed. The request was disclosed in a court filing that's part of a proposed settlement prosecutors reached last week. And Japan's TOPIX index is set to snap a 5-day winning streak as concerns over tariffs resurfaced after a U.S. federal appeals court temporarily blocked a ruling that threatened to throw out the bulk of President Donald Trump's levies. Meanwhile, the country's top trade negotiator is heading to Washington for its 4th round of trade negotiations with the U.S. Bloomberg's Tokyo Bureau Chief Isabel Reynolds is with us. Isabel, what do we expect from this 4th round of tariff negotiations on Friday?
Right, as you mentioned, Minister Akazawa is now in Washington for this 4th round of talks. It's quite hard to read the tea leaves. Of course, trade negotiators in any negotiation are always pretty tight-lipped about what's going on, but there are no real obvious signs that, that there's any dramatic progress towards a solution at the moment. On the other hand, for the Japanese side, there's a lot of pressure towards reaching a solution soon. For example, the 25% tariff on cars is already hurting the industry in Japan. We're hurtling towards July the 9th when we'll see a 24% tariff across the board on Japanese exports to the US. And on top of that, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba faces a national upper house election at the end of July, and with consumers here in Japan facing high inflation, he'll want to be offering them some sign that he's reached a resolution and that there could be lower inflation to come in the future. There is one issue on which perhaps Japan hopes that it can move forward. Recently we've had more positive noises from Donald Trump about the merger between Nippon Steel and US Steel. And Japan may be hoping that a very favorable deal for the US on that side could lead into some progress on the tariff side if they can persuade Donald Trump that this is a triumph for the US side in terms of the steel industry.
Isabel, thank you so much for that. Bloomberg's Tokyo Bureau Chief Isabel Reynolds. Now, Taiwan, too, is continuing efforts to secure a trade deal with the U.S. However, its deputy foreign minister said that market speculation that the Taiwan dollar's recent gains were a gesture of goodwill to the U.S. are an overstatement. Chen Ming-chi spoke exclusively with Bloomberg about how the island's government is handling its currency in trade talks.
currency is not part of our trade negotiation with the U.S. I think, we are a free trading state, so our currency inevitably have many ups and downs. So I think that is nature. And let's not forget, I mean, the whole Asian currencies now in the appreciation trend. So I think including Taiwan dollar is no exception.
Taiwan has repeatedly said that exchange rate was not talked about. But the speculation alone was enough to spark
certainly.
This
Unfortunately,
surge.
that is a thing. So our central bank have to manage this expectation.
There's chatter now even that there's a narrative at least that Taiwan is allowing the currency to appreciate in terms of as a goodwill, like a gift to the U.S., without the U.S. even addressing it. What do you have to say about that?
I think that is an overstatement about how our central bank capable of and willing to do. I think we respect. We don't want to see a very big swing in our currency like any country in the world. I think it's only nature, but we don't intervene the market mechanism all the time. So only if there is a big swing that is in danger our own whole economy, then we'll try to adopt some policy to make some unnecessary adjustment.
What about just internally? Has the currency been a topic of discussion?
You mean inside the government?
Yeah, as you approach these trade talks. No. What's happening? You guys are not talking about it.
We watch it closely, but that doesn't fall into foreign ministry's obligation or duty to do that. But my understanding is that we don't really intervene, but we are concerned party. And I think our central bank, given the size, they monitor it all the time, but they try not to intervene.
If the U.S. were to bring it up, though, how would Taiwan address it? What's the approach?
The approach is that, again, we have to manage this, and we have to negotiate with the United States, our counterpart in the United States, and try not to create too much of turbulence to the market. I think that is a main goal for Taiwan.
And that was Taiwan's Deputy Foreign Minister speaking exclusively with the China Show co-anchor Yvonne Mann there. Now, we're also awaiting India's first quarter GDP data due in the coming hours. Bloomberg Economics is forecasting a bounce back to 6.8% growth for the period, up from 6.2% in the fourth quarter. Now, that is it for Insight. Horizons Middle East and Africa is next. Do keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.